It was a Tuesday morning when Lena Taylor's day was abruptly interrupted. The sun was just beginning to climb over the horizon, casting a soft golden light over the quiet streets of her neighborhood. Lena was on her way to the office, already mentally reviewing the presentation she would give that afternoon to a group of federal safety experts. She was deeply entrenched in the world of workplace safety. Her work had led to crucial changes in industrial protocols, saving lives, and preventing disasters. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was necessary. As she turned a corner, the flashing red and blue lights of a police car blinked in her rearview mirror. Lena's heart sank, a reflexive anxiety rising in her chest. She hadn't done anything wrong, but the feeling of being pulled over still felt like a violation of her time and space. With a sigh, she slowed down, guiding her car to the side of the road. She knew the drill. A uniformed officer emerged from the patrol car, his expression unreadable. He tapped on her window and Lena rolled it down, offering a polite but slightly wary smile. She had been stopped by officers before, and every time, there was a sense of being judged by factors outside her control. Still, Lena was used to keeping her cool in these situations. She had learned long ago that keeping a calm demeanor was key to navigating a world that often wasn't kind to women, especially women of color. "Good morning, ma'am," the officer said curtly, his voice flat. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Lena blinked, slightly taken aback. She was sure she hadn't been speeding, and her car was in good condition. She wasn't sure what to expect. "I'm not entirely sure," she replied, trying to keep her tone neutral. "Is there something wrong?" The officer glanced at his clipboard, his eyes briefly scanning her car before returning to her face. "You failed to signal when changing lanes back there," he stated, pointing behind her at the intersection. Lena felt a brief flash of frustration, but she quickly tamped it down. "I did signal," she said calmly. "I've been driving for years and always make sure to signal when changing lanes. Perhaps it was a misunderstanding." The officer didn't immediately respond. He seemed to study her for a moment, almost as if trying to figure out if she was being truthful. Lena's mind briefly wandered, wondering if the officer was making assumptions about her based on her appearance or demeanor. She quickly dismissed the thought. There was no need to go down that road. She had places to be. "I'll need to issue a ticket," the officer finally said, his words matter of fact. "Please step out of the vehicle." Lena blinked, startled. It wasn't a major infraction, and she certainly hadn't expected to be asked to step out. "Is this really necessary?" she asked, her voice steady but confused. "I'm happy to take care of the ticket right here." The officer's face hardened. "Step out of the vehicle, Mom." Lena hesitated, but her instincts told her to comply. Her mind raced. Was it a misunderstanding? Or was there something else at play here? She stepped out of the car, her eyes scanning the quiet street, noticing the early morning joggers passing by, none of them paying attention to the scene unfolding. The officer handed her the ticket, and without another word, returned to his patrol car. Lena stood there for a moment, staring at the citation in her hand. A wave of disbelief washed over her. It wasn't just the ticket. It was the feeling of being dismissed, of being treated as just another nameless person in the system. But that wasn't who she was. She was someone who had fought tirelessly to change the very systems that often overlooked people like her. Still, as the officer drove away, leaving her standing alone on the side of the road, she couldn't help but wonder how this simple encounter might change the course of her day, and perhaps even her life. Little did she know, this minor traffic stop would spark a series of events that would bring her into the very heart of a courtroom, face to face with a judge who would soon come to realize just how much more Lena Taylor was than the woman he thought he was sentencing. The morning sun had already started its ascent when Lena arrived at the small courthouse. She stood outside for a moment, collecting herself. This was not the sort of situation she was accustomed to. She was usually in boardrooms or speaking at conferences, working on federal safety regulations, influencing policies that would safeguard people's lives. Yet here she was, about to face a judge over a trivial traffic violation. It felt surreal. Lena adjusted her blazer and took a deep breath. She was prepared to handle this, though she wasn't sure what exactly she was walking into. The courthouse was quiet, the walls lined with old wood paneling, the smell of musty paper heavy in the air. There was a sense of gravity to the place, despite its unassuming appearance. She had no idea what to expect from the proceedings, but she knew one thing. She would not let this slip by without addressing the unjust nature of the situation. Inside the courtroom, a few individuals milled about, talking in hushed voices. They all paused as Lena entered, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. The atmosphere shifted as she made her way to the front. She had hoped for a simple, straightforward hearing, a brief explanation, a payment of the fine, and that would be it. But the moment she set her briefcase down on the table, the tension in the room was palpable. The judge, Samuel Whittaker, an older man with a stern face, looked up from the papers in front of him. His eyes narrowed as he scanned Lena for a moment before he spoke, his voice deep and authoritative. "Miss Taylor, I presume," he said, his tone neutral but with an undercurrent of something Lena couldn't quite place. "Yes, Your Honor," Lena replied, her voice calm but firm. Judge Whittaker gave a brief nod, his gavel clicking against the wooden desk. "Let's get started then. You've been cited for failing to signal when changing lanes. Do you dispute the charges?" Lena hesitated for a moment. She hadn't expected to be greeted with such directness. She briefly wondered if the judge had already made up his mind about her, but she didn't let that show. She had a point to make. "I do dispute the charges, Your Honor," Lena said, her voice steady. "I believe the officer misjudged the situation. I signaled properly, and I have no history of traffic violations." The judge raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "You're disputing a straightforward citation?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I see. And what makes you think you're entitled to challenge this in such a manner?" Lena took a deep breath. She had expected this. His doubt, his assumptions, she was used to it. She knew how often people underestimated her based on her appearance, but she wasn't here to back down. "I'm not trying to avoid responsibility, Your Honor," Lena said calmly. "I simply believe this was an error. I'm asking for a review of the evidence." Judge Whittaker's eyes narrowed slightly as he leaned forward. "I'm afraid we're not in a position to review evidence on the spot, Ms. Taylor. You'll need to pay the fine unless you have some compelling reason to continue this further." Lena's pulse quickened. She had prepared for the worst, but something about the judge's dismissive tone didn't sit right with her. She felt the weight of her own career and accomplishments pressing down on her shoulders. She wasn't just Lena Taylor, an ordinary citizen being judged for a minor infraction. She was a woman who had worked tirelessly to change the way the country approached safety in the workplace. If the judge knew anything about her work, maybe he would rethink his stance. But instead, the judge simply looked at her, waiting for her response. There was a deep, unsettling silence between them. It felt like a test, a challenge to her dignity and her place in the world. "Your Honor, with all due respect," Lena began, her voice still measured but now tinged with a hint of frustration. "I believe this issue goes beyond a traffic ticket. I'm involved in the development of national safety standards, and it's my professional opinion that we must challenge assumptions and errors, no matter how small, to ensure that systems work fairly for everyone." The room was still. No one moved. Lena's words hung in the air like a challenge to the very system that had brought her here. Judge Whittaker seemed taken aback, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than he intended. Then, without a word, he gestured for his clerk to take the case file. "We'll continue this matter in a moment. Ms. Taylor, please remain seated." Lena sat down, her heart still pounding. She had spoken from her truth, but she wasn't sure if the judge had truly heard her, or if he had simply seen her as just another person in a system that didn't care about her. The weight of the silence in the room pressed on her, but one thing was certain: this wasn't over. As the courtroom remained hushed, Lena's thoughts raced. She had expected some form of resistance, But the judge's cold, dismissive attitude had stung in a way she hadn't anticipated. She glanced around the room, noticing the way the others were looking at her. It wasn't with curiosity or respect, but with a sort of quiet indifference. She was just another person in a long line of cases to be processed, her presence merely a footnote in the day's proceedings. But Lena knew better. She wasn't just another name on a docket. She was someone who had fought for years to be heard, to make a difference. Her work wasn't about trivial matters. It was about saving lives. It was about changing the way industries approached safety and hazard prevention, particularly in fields like construction and oil, where safety protocols were often overlooked. She had dedicated her life to ensuring that workers in high-risk environments returned home safely every day. Her thoughts were interrupted as Judge Whittaker cleared his throat, signaling for attention. The room quieted, and everyone turned their focus to him. He had obviously made a decision, but Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was a tension in the air, a strange sense of hesitation in his movements. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked over at Lena, who met his gaze with steady eyes, her hands folded in her lap. "Miss Taylor," Judge Whittaker began, his tone no longer as dismissive as it had been before. "I've been informed that you are involved in a rather unique profession. Is that correct?" Lena blinked in surprise. This wasn't the direction she had expected the conversation to take. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, trying to mask the nervousness creeping up her spine. "I work with federal agencies to develop and enforce safety protocols for industrial workplaces." The judge leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the edge of the desk. "I see. And what exactly does that entail?" he asked, his voice soft, but with a genuine curiosity now present that hadn't been there before. Lena paused for a moment, weighing her words. This was unexpected territory, but if there was a chance to explain her work, to make him understand the importance of her contributions, she would seize it. "It means I help create guidelines and strategies to prevent accidents," she began slowly. "I specialize in identifying hazards that aren't immediately obvious, things that could lead to catastrophic incidents if left unchecked. I've worked with several government agencies to improve standards for everything from machinery safety to fire protocols. The goal is simple: to save lives." The judge's expression softened, though he didn't interrupt her. Lena could tell he was listening now, truly absorbing what she was saying. It felt like the courtroom had shifted, where once it had been a place of judgment and procedure, now it felt more like a space for genuine conversation. "I imagine that's not the easiest task," Judge Whittaker mused. "To change the way entire industries think and operate, that must take a great deal of persistence." Lena nodded, a flicker of appreciation passing through her. "It does. But it's necessary. People are dying on the job every day because safety isn't prioritized. It's my job to make sure we don't wait for a disaster to occur before we take action." The judge paused, his hands now resting on the desk. He didn't speak for a long moment, as if processing what she had just shared. Lena could feel the change in the room. The air seemed less tense, the atmosphere less charged. She wasn't just a woman in a courtroom anymore. She was someone with a purpose, with a mission. Finally, Judge Whittaker broke the silence, his voice more thoughtful than before. "Miss Taylor, I have to admit, I wasn't aware of the scope of your work until now. I can see that you are a person of considerable importance. Perhaps my initial judgment was hasty." Lena felt a brief surge of relief but didn't let it show on her face. Instead, she simply nodded. "I understand, Your Honor." It's not always easy to understand the full picture until you see it for yourself. Judge Whittaker gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging her point. "Thank you for explaining. I believe we need more people like you, working behind the scenes to protect others. Your work is valuable." Lena couldn't help but feel a flicker of pride, not because the judge had acknowledged her work, but because for the first time in a long while, she felt like someone, like her, was being seen. In a courtroom full of people, that was a rarity. The judge cleared his throat again, signaling that the next phase of the hearing was about to begin. "I'll need to review the details of your citation before making a final decision," he said, his voice back to its formal tone. "Please be patient for a moment." Lena remained seated, feeling the weight of the moment. This case wasn't just about a traffic fine anymore. It was about something much larger. The intersection of her work, her identity, and how others perceived her. As the judge delved deeper into the details, Lena couldn't help but wonder, was this just a chance encounter, or was it something more? A chance to challenge assumptions and make people see her not just as a woman with a citation, but as someone who was changing the world. As Judge Whittaker continued to peruse the documents in front of him, the silence in the courtroom deepened. Lena sat still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her mind racing. She had spoken her truth, explained her work with the same precision and passion that had earned her respect in her field. Yet there was still a sense of unease that lingered in the air. She wasn't sure if it was the tension of the courtroom or the nagging feeling that despite her words, the judge might still see her as just another traffic violator. But then something unexpected happened. The judge pushed the papers aside and, for the first time, looked directly at Lena with a more focused expression. He cleared his throat, the sternness of his earlier demeanor softening. "Miss Taylor," he began, his voice surprisingly thoughtful, "I must admit, I've looked into your background. What you do, it's remarkable." Lena's eyebrows shot up, but she kept her expression neutral. She hadn't expected him to do any research so quickly, but she was also grateful that he seemed to be taking her work seriously now. "I have to admit, I was unaware of the extent of your contributions until my clerks looked into them," he continued. "You've been involved in shaping some of the most important safety regulations in federal history, haven't you?" Lena nodded, feeling a rush of gratitude that the judge was now recognizing her for more than just a simple citation. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady. "I've worked on several projects that have helped improve the safety standards in industries where people are at risk every day: construction, manufacturing, energy. My team and I focus on creating protocols that address hazards before they result in accidents." The judge seemed to mull over her words. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the wooden desk. There was a long pause before he spoke again. "I don't know much about the intricacies of safety protocols, but what I do know is that your work is something that has saved lives. It's clear to me now that this is bigger than a mere traffic ticket. Your impact on the world is undeniable," Judge Whittaker said, his voice less formal now, more reflective. Lena felt her chest tighten. This was the recognition she had longed for, but not in this setting. She hadn't expected to stand in front of a judge to explain her career, to have her work validated like this. Yet, the weight of the judge's words felt heavy with meaning. She realized, in that moment, that perhaps the road she had taken had led her here for a reason. "Your Honor, thank you," she replied softly. "But I didn't come here today seeking recognition. I simply want fairness. I want people to be seen for who they truly are, not just for their mistakes or assumptions based on what they look like or where they come from." Judge Whittaker nodded slowly, as if processing her words. "I understand," he said, his tone now genuinely empathetic. "And I see your point. I've heard many cases over the years, but I can't say I've ever encountered someone like you." Lena didn't know whether to be flattered or concerned. She had worked tirelessly to build a reputation that would stand on its own, one that didn't rely on the superficial judgments that often define people like her. But now, here she was, standing in front of a judge, pleading for fairness over something as insignificant as a traffic violation. It felt both absurd and necessary at the same time. "I will take your case under advisement, Miss Taylor," Judge Whittaker said, his voice quiet but firm. "But I want to make it clear that I'm not just considering this fine. I'm considering everything you've told me. And that's going to weigh on my final decision." For the first time since this hearing began, Lena felt a sense of hope stirring within her. It wasn't about the ticket anymore. It was about a larger recognition of her work, her purpose, and the importance of being seen for more than just a momentary mistake. The judge's acknowledgement of her profession wasn't just a token gesture. It felt like a turning point, not only in this case, but in her own journey. As the judge flipped through more papers, Lena knew that the courtroom would never feel the same to her again. The blinders had come off, both for the judge and for her. This encounter, this unlikely meeting, had revealed something deeper, a shared understanding that sometimes a single conversation could shatter preconceived notions and pave the way for something more meaningful. She just hoped that by the end of this, Judge Whittaker would truly understand what it meant to fight for change, and how it often starts with something as simple as asking to be seen. The quiet hum of the courtroom filled the brief moments of silence that followed Judge Whittaker's reflection. Lena's heart was still racing, her mind spinning with everything that had transpired so far. She had spoken honestly, shared her passion for safety regulations, and conveyed the importance of the work she did. But despite the judge's newfound understanding of her profession, she wasn't sure what would happen next. Would the recognition of her work change the outcome of this seemingly trivial traffic citation? The judge appeared deep in thought, his fingers still tapping lightly on the desk as he reviewed the papers in front of him. It wasn't clear whether he was contemplating her words or whether he was simply sorting through the procedural details of the case. His brow furrowed as he continued to read, his expression a mix of contemplation and deliberation. Lena's mind drifted for a moment as she considered the larger implications of this situation. She had built her career by fighting to create safer environments for those who worked in dangerous conditions. Her research had influenced national policy on worker safety. Yet here she was, standing before a judge, her reputation reduced to a simple citation for an alleged traffic violation. The irony of it all wasn't lost on her. But perhaps, she thought, this moment was a chance to break through those assumptions, one small step toward making a larger impact. "Miss Taylor," the judge finally said, his voice breaking the silence, "I've taken the time to carefully review both your case and the details of your work." He paused, looking up from the documents, his gaze meeting hers. "I have to say, I'm impressed. I was not aware of the depth and importance of the work you do, and I can see now how much you've contributed to safety regulations that protect people in high-risk industries." Lena nodded respectfully, a small, appreciative smile tugging at her lips. It was gratifying to hear the judge acknowledge her efforts, but she had learned long ago that recognition in her field was often fleeting. What mattered most was the work itself, the changes made, the lives saved, the protocols that were now more effective because of her input. That said, Judge Whittaker continued, "I am still responsible for administering the law. It's clear that you dispute the citation, and I have to consider both your perspective and the officer's report. I understand that you feel the officer may have misjudged the situation, but it's also important that we respect the procedures of law enforcement." Lena's pulse quickened. She had anticipated this. Despite everything, the judge's words carried a weight of finality. She knew the law had its processes, and there was a chance she would still be held accountable for something she felt was a misunderstanding. The judge shifted in his seat and took a deep breath. However, he added, his voice softer now, "I also believe that systems, like the one you work within, must be examined and questioned, especially when errors are made. Your work, your dedication to ensuring safety, shows that change is possible, even in systems that seem rigid or unmovable. And perhaps this moment is an opportunity to question a process that feels like a minor oversight, but carries larger consequences in terms of fairness." Lena's heart skipped a beat. The judge's words were more than just about her ticket now. They were about something far bigger. He wasn't just talking about a traffic violation. He was acknowledging her broader philosophy about systems and fairness. "In light of your work, Miss Taylor," Judge Whittaker said after another long pause, "I've decided to dismiss this citation." Lena blinked, unable to fully process what she had just heard. Dismissed. The judge was dismissing the ticket. Her mind took a moment to catch up with her reality. "I believe that your contributions to the betterment of safety standards outweigh the nature of this charge," he continued. "You've made a difference in ways that go far beyond this minor infraction, and I feel that it would be unjust to penalize you over something so insignificant when you are doing such important work." Lena couldn't help the relief that washed over her. It wasn't just the dismissal of the ticket that took her by surprise. It was the judge's recognition of her work, his acknowledgement of her passion for change, and the validation of her efforts in a system that often overlooked those who fought for the greater good. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but filled with gratitude. "I appreciate your understanding and your decision." Judge Whittaker nodded, offering a rare smile. "You're welcome, Ms. Taylor. Keep doing the work that you're doing. The world needs more people like you." Lena felt a sense of warmth spread through her, not just because the case had been resolved in her favor, but because, for once, she had felt seen. Not just as a woman being judged for a traffic violation, but as someone with a purpose and a mission that reached far beyond the courtroom walls. As she stood to leave, the weight of the day began to lift. This was more than just a minor victory. It was a moment where her work had been recognized, not for its scope or scale, but for the simple fact that it was changing lives. The judge's decision was a testament to the idea that sometimes, when you fight for what's right, the systems you challenge can also be the ones that ultimately support you. Lena stepped out of the courtroom, her mind still racing, processing the unexpected turn of events. The bright afternoon sun seemed to reflect her newfound clarity. She had come to the courthouse fearing the worst, a simple traffic ticket turning into a frustrating experience that would distract her from her real work. Instead, she had left with something far more significant: the validation of her purpose and the recognition of her contributions to the world of safety regulation. As she walked down the courthouse steps, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The anxiety that had initially gripped her was now replaced with a quiet confidence. Judge Whittaker's words echoed in her mind. "You're doing important work. The world needs more people like you." It wasn't just a nice sentiment. It was an affirmation that the work she had been doing for years had a profound impact, not just in her industry, but in the way people saw the world. She had spent so much of her career focusing on the systemic issues that affected industrial safety, fighting battles in boardrooms and policy meetings, often feeling like her efforts went unnoticed or underappreciated. Yet today, she had felt heard. And that feeling, in itself, was invaluable. As Lena made her way to her car, her phone buzzed with a new message. She glanced at the screen. An email from one of the federal agencies she worked closely with. It was a notification about an upcoming safety conference she had been asked to speak at, a request she had almost forgotten about in the midst of her recent whirlwind. Her heart skipped a beat. The invitation had come just as she was stepping out of the courtroom, a sign that the universe was aligning in ways she hadn't expected. The conference was an important event, a gathering of safety experts and policymakers, where she had the chance to share the latest developments in her work. She had been a speaker at these conferences before, but this year's invitation felt different. She wasn't just going to talk about policy or regulations. She was going to speak about the human element behind those policies, about the lives that could be saved if industries started to prioritize safety over profits. As she sat in her car and read the email again, she realized something else. The judge's decision had reminded her why she started in this line of work in the first place. It wasn't about titles, recognition, or even the large-scale changes that often took years to materialize. It was about the small, everyday moments where her work made a difference. The families who were able to sleep easier knowing that their loved ones were going to return home safely. The workers who had one less thing to worry about when they clocked in for their shift. This was what mattered. Lena took a deep breath and started the engine, the hum of the car soothing her racing thoughts. She was still processing everything that had happened, but she felt a sense of purpose that had been reignited in her. Today's unexpected encounter had been a wake-up call, a reminder that every part of the journey, even the seemingly insignificant moments, played a role in shaping the bigger picture. As she pulled out of the parking lot, She made a mental note to send a thank you message to Judge Whittaker. It wasn't just about the decision he had made. It was about how he had taken the time to listen to her, to understand her work, and ultimately, to acknowledge the value of her efforts. In a world that often rushed to judge and dismiss, his open-mindedness was a rare gift. By the time Lena arrived back at her office, the seed of inspiration had already started to take root. She would approach the upcoming conference differently, with a renewed sense of purpose. She would tell the story of how small decisions could spark larger changes, how understanding each other's work was the first step toward creating better systems. And perhaps, just maybe, this conversation with the judge would inspire others to take a step back and reconsider how they viewed not only Lena, but also the work that so many others were doing to improve the safety and well-being of those around them. For the first time in a long while, Lena felt certain that she was on the right path, one where she wasn't just advocating for change, but also being recognized for the difference she had already made. And that, she thought, was enough to keep pushing forward. The days following the courtroom encounter passed in a blur, yet the effects of that brief moment in front of Judge Whittaker lingered far longer than Lena had expected. It wasn't just the relief of having her ticket dismissed, or the unexpected validation of her work. It was the door that had been opened for new opportunities, new ways of thinking about her mission. At the safety conference, as Lena prepared to take the stage in front of an audience of policymakers, industry leaders, and fellow safety experts, her mind kept returning to the judge's words. "The world needs more people like you." It was a phrase that, in many ways, had reignited her sense of purpose. She knew that the changes she had been striving for were still far from complete, and the journey ahead would be long. But for the first time in a while, she felt a deeper clarity about why her work mattered. When it was her turn to speak, she walked up to the podium with a new sense of confidence. As she looked out over the crowd of attentive faces, she knew that these were the people who could help make her vision a reality. She wasn't just here to share statistics or policy guidelines. This was her moment to tell a story about the human side of safety, about how each regulation had a face, a family, a life behind it. "Good morning," Lena began, her voice steady and clear. "I want to talk today about the things we don't always see, about the risks that go unnoticed in the workplace, and the lives that are often ignored when it comes to safety." The room grew silent, and she could feel their attention shift toward her. She continued, sharing personal anecdotes of accidents that could have been prevented with simple safety measures, recounting case studies where small changes in protocol had saved lives. She didn't shy away from the hard truths, but she balanced them with optimism, showing how progress was possible when the right people stood together and pushed for change. Throughout her speech, Lena spoke not just as a safety expert, but as someone who had faced her own challenges in the fight for better standards. She shared how her work had sometimes been met with resistance, how industries had initially resisted the changes she proposed because it would cost them more in the short term. But she also told stories of the breakthroughs, the moments when key decision-makers had finally seen the light, when safety measures became not just about compliance, but about preserving human life. By the time Lena finished her presentation, the room erupted into applause, and she could sense a shift. The executives in the audience were nodding thoughtfully. The policymakers were leaning forward in their seats. This wasn't just another speech, it was a call to action. As Lena stepped down from the podium, she felt a surge of energy. The response had been overwhelming, and it was clear that her message had struck a chord. Several people approached her afterward, eager to discuss her work further, to explore ways they could integrate her insights into their own industries. There were even discussions about creating collaborative efforts between her organization and some of the larger corporations present at the conference. One of the most unexpected moments came when a representative from the U.S. Department of Labor approached her. He introduced himself as someone who had been following her research for years. "I've seen firsthand the incredible impact of your work," he said, shaking her hand. "We've been discussing new initiatives on federal safety guidelines, and I'd love to see how we can integrate your strategies into our plans. This could be the beginning of something big." Lena felt a mixture of surprise and excitement. This wasn't just an opportunity. It was a chance to have her work shape national safety policy in ways she had always dreamed of. She exchanged contact information with the representative, and they agreed to meet in the coming weeks to discuss the potential collaboration. As Lena walked out of the conference center that evening, she felt a quiet pride. The world she had been working to change was starting to take notice. It wasn't just about the personal recognition or the accolades. It was about the impact, the way her efforts were beginning to resonate on a larger scale. The validation from Judge Whittaker, the conversations at the conference, and the unexpected outreach from government representatives all felt like signs that her work was finally being seen for what it truly was, a revolution in safety protocols. For the first time in a long while, Lena felt as though the hard work, the years of fighting for change, had all led to this moment. She wasn't just a voice in the background anymore. She was at the forefront, shaping the future. And as she gazed out at the city skyline on her way home, she realized that the road ahead was filled with limitless possibilities, one she was more than ready to pursue. Months passed since the conference, and Lena's life had taken a dramatic turn. The momentum from the event didn't just fade into the background. It fueled the next phase of her journey. The discussion she had sparked with industry leaders and government officials had blossomed into concrete collaborations. New safety protocols were beginning to emerge, shaped by the very research and strategies Lena had developed over the years. The partnership with the U.S. Department of Labor had been the most significant breakthrough. Lena's strategies for improving safety in high-risk industries were being incorporated into federal guidelines. She had been asked to serve as an advisor, helping to shape new policies that would affect millions of workers across the country. It was the culmination of everything she had worked for, the moment when her voice was heard on a national level. But it wasn't just the recognition that had changed. Lena had also noticed a shift in herself. There was a quiet confidence in the way she now approached her work. The fight she had waged for years to prove that safety couldn't be an afterthought had evolved into something far more impactful. It was no longer about pushing against resistance. It was about building something lasting, something that would carry forward, long after she was no longer at the forefront of the conversation. The story of her courtroom encounter with Judge Whittaker had also spread. What had started as an unexpected twist in a traffic violation case had turned into an example of how one individual could shift the narrative. Her case had become a symbol of the importance of questioning the systems we often take for granted and the power of seeing each person as more than just their mistakes. It was a story that was shared at the very same safety conference she had spoken at, one that resonated deeply with people who had also felt the sting of being overlooked or underestimated. Lena had been invited to speak at other conferences around the country. She had been asked to write articles for journals and contribute to discussions about the intersection of policy and human-centered safety practices. The more she shared her story, the more people reached out, eager to understand how they could contribute to a larger change. Her work, once confined to a small circle of safety experts, was now reaching far beyond the industry. One of the most fulfilling moments came when she was invited to speak at a ceremony for a new federal safety law that had just passed. It was the culmination of years of advocacy, research, and tireless work. The law, in part, was a direct result of the efforts she had put forth, and she was honored to be part of the celebration. Standing before the crowd, Lena reflected on how far she had come. She thought about the traffic violation that had set everything in motion, the seemingly insignificant event that had ultimately opened doors to opportunities she never imagined. That moment in the courtroom had been a catalyst, but it had been her dedication, her drive, and her ability to stay true to her mission that had carried her to this point. As she took the stage, Lena looked out over the sea of faces in the crowd. She saw policymakers, workers, industry leaders, all of them there because of the change she had helped inspire. The applause that followed her speech wasn't just for her. It was for the lives that would be saved because of the new safety regulations, for the families who would feel a little less anxious as their loved ones went to work each day. As the ceremony ended, Lena stepped off the stage, and walked toward a group of young safety engineers who were waiting to speak with her. They had all grown up admiring her work, and now they were eager to carry the torch forward. "Thank you for everything you've done," one of them said, a hopeful gleam in his eyes. "We're ready to keep building on what you've started." Lena smiled, her heart full. The road had been long, but it was leading to a future she had always dreamed of, one where her work didn't just make a difference in the present, but shaped a lasting legacy for generations to come. She had started her journey seeking justice in a simple courtroom, and now she was a part of something much larger, a movement that was changing the fabric of industries, ensuring safety, and most importantly, saving lives. As Lena left the ceremony that day, she understood that the journey never truly ends. There would always be more work to do, more battles to fight, and more people to inspire. But she was ready. She had found her purpose, and now it was her responsibility to continue the fight. No longer just as a woman with a mission, but as a leader in a movement that was shaping the future.